Okay, hello everyone, welcome to this event. I'm Emma Norris, the Deputy Director of the Institute for Government. Today we're talking about effective urban leadership. What are the international lessons for England's mayors? Now, as part of the devolution agenda, we know that the government here is deepening and extending the mayoral model across England. We've got 14 regional mayors now in office. They hold powers over things like transport, skills, housing and planning, economic growth and more. And we know that the government wants every region of England to have a mayor eventually. So what are the characteristics of effective mayoral leadership specifically? How does that differ to other kinds of political leader? How should mayors use their existing powers and their platform to bring benefits to the regions that they represent? And what can they learn from their international comparators? We're going to explore all those questions today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Jorrit de Jong. He's the director of the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard University. Bloomberg have really led the way on supporting effective mayors in the US and beyond. And Jorrit's going to talk to us for about 10 minutes about his experience and what they've learned about effective mayorships. Following Jorrit's talk, we're going to have a bit of conversation. Akash, our Programme Director for Devolution, is going to talk a bit about our work here in England on effective mayors and what that looks like. Then we'll have some conversation between the three of us, and we'll leave lots of time for questions from the audience in the room and online. I know we've got quite a big online audience. You don't have to wait until question time to start submitting questions. If you have questions, do start submitting them using the Slido function any time from now, and I'll make sure that I bring them in. Okay, Jorrit, I'm going to hand over to you. Got the podium.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I have worked with 10 mayors from the United Kingdom, and it's been a real pleasure. It's been also really interesting seeing how they take on their roles and how they engage in what we call mayoral leadership. The director, my role is director of the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard University, and what we do is we advance urban problem solving through research, teaching, and direct engagement with practice. And I'm going to share a little bit about what that looks like, what we've learned, and then hopefully engage in a conversation about how those lessons might apply to your country, but also how we are currently thinking about new avenues for research and problem solving in practice. So we've worked with over 300 mayors through the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative, which is at its heart a program that supports mayors as they develop the capabilities for effective problem solving. So what that means is it's a leadership training program, but it is also a sustained effort to leverage the assets that city government has to do better, to make government more effective, more efficient, more responsive to social needs, more accountable, and so forth. And if we only invested in the mayors, we would probably help them to some extent, but we realized early on that no mayor can do it alone. And for that reason, we invite mayors to select the top civil servants that they rely on most to make change in their organizations and in their communities. So we've also worked with a few thousand senior city officials. And when I talk about mayoral leadership, I will really think about the larger team supporting the mayor as well as the mayor herself or himself. We've worked in over 40 countries, and obviously the political and cultural and economic context is different from country to country. But it's remarkable how many similarities there are for mayors. And if you think about what the biggest common denominator is for mayors, it's probably the fact that they have to do really hard work, really important work, without necessarily having sufficient authority or resources. So the fundamental predicament is you're closest to the problems, you're closest to the people, but you have not as much formal authority as you wish, and you don't have the resources to solve all those problems. So That means that you have to be innovative, that you have to be strategic, that you have to be nimble, and that you have to continuously learn on how to do better. So that's what our program facilitates. The job of a mayor, you see here Jennifer Musisi, who was the chief executive of Kampala in Uganda, on the right-hand side of the slide. So while she wasn't formally a mayor, she was the top political executive of Kampala, city of 5 million people. She spent 2 years at the center, and we worked a lot with her on a few cases that exemplify the role of the mayor. Now, of course, Kampala has its own specific context, but it was really remarkable how many of the lessons that she shared also resonated with mayors from the US and from Europe and Latin America. And fundamentally, every mayor has a dual job, a public-facing job and an organization-facing job. And those two jobs require specific skill sets. As a public-facing figure, you need to engage people in speeches, but also in many community events. And you have to be the person that's sometimes the consoler-in-chief, sometimes the negotiator-in-chief, and sometimes the person who communicates highly unpopular decisions. Think about the COVID times when you have to close businesses or close schools or install mask mandates and so forth. So that public-facing job is demanding in and of itself. The organization-facing job is equally complex because many mayors come to the job without necessarily having experience in leading large and complex bureaucracies. And therefore, there's a lot for them to learn that you can't find in any textbook that you were not really prepared for in school and so forth. So to be an effective mayor is to learn fast, is to learn deeply, and is to learn collaboratively. What we do to facilitate that learning is not tell them what to do, obviously. But it is to create an environment in which they learn from each other, in which they learn from research that might be helpful to them, and where they learn from doing the work in practice. And that's why this is not a program of just 1 week of convening, but it's also a year long of picking a problem and really trying to see how they can make progress by adapting promising practices from elsewhere, by diagnosing their challenges in different ways with new analytic frameworks, and by bringing people together to do the work. And what that work is about is capability building. It is thinking about what it takes to better diagnose the problems, whether we're talking about crime or climate resilience or economic development or homelessness. Any of the more pressing challenges and more complex challenges require diagnosis. What really is driving the problem? Why hasn't it been solved yet? And what will keep us from solving it in the future? The capabilities are, of course, skills that people have. When you think about diagnosing a problem, you can learn how to do that better as an individual, and you can invest in many individuals in City Hall. But you also can invest in capabilities in organizations, and then we're calling them practices. So do you have structures and processes and systems that allow you to diagnose better, that allow you to generate better solutions, and that allow you to implement effectively and efficiently? So here's an example from Laredo, Texas, where Mayor Pete Saenz is working with one of our graduate students, Santiago Mota, on diagnosing why single-parent households live below the poverty line despite services being available to them. And this was an allocation problem. They didn't know how to reach the people who could benefit most from the available services. And so this is one of those examples where through better diagnosis, through disaggregating the data, through mapping the problem, you can, with the same amount of resources, deliver better services to the residents. Another example is our work on organizational and sectoral boundary crossing, which basically means bringing different departments and governments as well as different sectors in the city together around a problem. We have worked with many cities on inclusive growth, which requires not just the economic development department, but also the education department, the health department, and other departments to work together and come up with a better diagnosis and better strategies. And finally, we think about innovating in government as an important capability, which basically means doing things in new ways. And that requires challenging the current theory of change. Why are we doing what we are currently doing? Why do we think that is the right way to accomplish the results we want? And what are some other ways to accomplishing what we want that are more effective? But that, of course, requires organizational change, and that's where the mayor comes in. So, to conclude, effective urban leadership is about mastering the two jobs that constitute that role, which is a public-facing job and an organization-facing job. It also requires continuously investing in both the managerial and the leadership skills. And John Cotter of the Harvard Business School distinguishes management and leadership as management is bringing order and consistency to organizations, and leadership is helping people cope with change. And mayors do both. They develop the capabilities to bring more order and consistency, to be more effective, efficient, responsive. But in order to do work in a different way, you have to help people cope with change. And sometimes those people are city councilors, sometimes those people are staff in City Hall, sometimes those people are the residents who need to act and behave in different ways. The capabilities that help you do that are leveraging data. Many cities have a lot of data, but underutilize them. Partnerships, really thinking about cross-silo collaboration and engaging the private and nonprofit sector and community organizations. And then leveraging ideas, the most promising practice from elsewhere. But you can't just think about promising practice as, copy and paste. Every local context requires adaptation of even evidence-based practices. You have to make something work for your local context. And that's why the focus on learning is so essential, because the more you learn about your own context and the problems in your own city, and the more you learn about what works elsewhere and why, the more likely you are to find a good fit between problems and solutions. On that note, I'm going to turn back over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jorrit. I wanted to pick up a few questions before I'm going to ask Akash to respond. In some ways, you've described a set of kind of capabilities and skills that mayors need. There are some similarities between mayors and national level politicians. You've described the public-facing nature of the role, the fact that they're often having to front unpopular decisions, make big decisions that directly affect people's lives. But you've also described some of the differences. You have mayors who generally hold fewer powers and have fewer resources, who are working closer in some ways to people's lives and the problems that affect them. So I guess I'm interested in how, given those differences, are the kind of capabilities that mayors need different to the capabilities that our national politicians need?
I think working at the local level is easier and harder. And it's easier because there's something that holds you close to the task. Most mayors live in the city that they run, if not all of them. And so you're close to the people. They will let you know when you do your grocery shopping. They will let you know when you meet them at an event. And you see for yourself, if the trash doesn't get picked up, if the snow is not plowed, if traffic is congested, if people are unhappy, you'll hear about it, you'll see it. So in a way, there's less room for distraction and distortion. On the other hand, it's harder because many cities, have restrictions on how much they can borrow. They have to get approval from other levels of government. They're constrained in many ways to do what's needed. And so They're very different jobs. I mean, they're similar in some ways, that you try to solve social problems and you try to deliver what you've promised to your voters. But the context is different, and the proximity to your constituents and the proximity to problems and solutions is different.
And you described having worked with mayors from all over the world. You've worked across 40 different countries. We're still learning in the UK. It's a relatively new model. Are there particular examples internationally that you would point to where a mayor has been especially successful, and that you think that countries like this one should be looking to and learning from as our model develops?
Yeah. I'll give you 3 quick ones from different parts of the world. I mentioned Jennifer Musisi, who in Kampala, Uganda, was remarkable in improving tax collection, which is, nothing else happens unless you have the revenues to do anything. And so she diagnosed the problem as like, if we're not good at collecting taxes from people who owe taxes to the government, then we cannot fund other things. And so that is the intervention point. And so she introduced an electronic tax collection system that eliminated opportunities for corruption and waste, and that allowed her to get a little bit more resources to then focus on cleaning up the city, investing in public education, and so forth. Another example is from Bilbao, Basque country, Spain, where in the 1980s, the city was looking pretty grim. There was an economic downturn. The public infrastructure was crippling, and so there was a lot of kind of instability generally. And so the mayors there worked with other levels of governments and across party lines to reimagine what the city could be. And they invested in the harbor. And to the point about innovation, they figured out a different way of using the land and creating different fiscal instruments that allowed them to invest not just in the harbor, but also in the larger public infrastructure. And the cherry on top was that the Guggenheim Museum came to Bilbao. That was not the cause of the economic upturn, but it was kind of a symptom of the change in the trajectory. And now I encourage all of you to visit Bilbao. It's a wonderful city. And finally, Buffalo in New York. Buffalo was dealing with historic inequality caused by redlining, which is a phenomenon in the United States where people of color could not access mortgages and home loans, and that had created a real segregation in the city, and underserved neighborhoods were really struggling with dilapidated buildings, again, crumbling public infrastructure. And what they did is they brought different departments from the city, about 10 to 15 departments, as well as community organizations, and went into the neighborhoods together on the same day, always on Wednesday mornings. And then they would walk and they would problem solve together. So rather than somebody coming in and fixing the potholes, somebody else checking on people who might be suffering from substance abuse, and other people coming in and trying to look at building inspections and so forth. They would all come together and they would problem solve and learn from what they saw, so that the system could be better aligned to invest in those neighborhoods. And they've been running that for 20 years, and as a result, not only did those neighborhoods improve, but also trust in government went up, because government was seen as competent, as collaborative, as responsive to their actual needs. So those are 3 examples of collaboration, innovation, and using data to drive progress in cities.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jorrit. I want to carry on the conversation, but I'm going to come to Akash now for some responses. Akash leads our work on English devolution, has made the case for completing the map, is doing lots of work directly with some of the English mayors. So, Akash, interested to hear your response to some of what Jorrit has said, and some of what we're doing here in IFG.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Emma, and great to have you with us. You're really fascinated to hear your take, and I think. In preparation for this, I was thinking about what my reflections are as to what makes for success as a regional or metro mayor here in England. We've not done much international comparative research, so I was thinking maybe a lot of this is specific to this country. You've already made the point that despite the differences in political and institutional context, a lot of what makes for effective urban leadership is common across the piece, and I was really fascinated to hear some of your examples. But I do think there are some specificities to the model and the policy context here in England, we're talking about really, rather than the UK. So yeah, I'd like to share some reflections on what we've observed. And I mean, Emma's already made the point. It's a great time to be having this conversation. Just had the 13th and 14th regional mayors elected. Lots more due to be established over the coming years if the government stays on track with its devolution agenda. And this is something we at the Institute for Government have been pretty supportive of. We do think it's right to aim for complete coverage of England. We think further powers should be devolved. There should be greater fiscal freedoms and investment in capacity and lots more. But I think it's very important to note that, when you look at the mayors we've had in post, the combined or strategic authorities that exist, performance and effectiveness has varied. I mean, we've got some that are very well established, places like Greater Manchester blazing the trail, taking on more powers and more freedoms. There's a number which are far newer but operating quite effectively, but still kind of climbing that learning curve. There's quite a few that are, very embryonic, really just getting off the ground, building the capacity from scratch in many cases. And then there are some that I think have been, dysfunctional in one way or another. And I think that's partly been due to structural factors, local political opposition to the model, a geography for the devolution arrangement that doesn't really make sense, weak capacity and so on. But it's certainly also been about the quality of leadership as well. And I think, without naming any names, I think we've seen maybe two forms of kind of poor approach to mayoral leadership. I think there've been some who found it a lot harder to develop and communicate a clear vision, a long-term vision for what they see as the potential of the region, how they intend to use devolved powers to get there, and have just maybe not really made that impact and made the case for the mayoral model and for devolution. And then we've had others, I think, who've come in and not quite understood the limitations of their role and have thought that by coming in and banging the table and kind of laying down the law, everyone's going to fall into line and here's my manifesto and everyone has to do what I say. And neither of those has worked very well. And then I think we've had quite a number who have been successful where they've worked within the limitations of the system. So as, this is not an original observation, but, one thing that's very striking about the regional mayor model we have in the UK is that they're not strong individual executive leaders. There's not a huge amount they can do just as mayor themselves. They have to act, I think, as Andy Burnham put it recently here on this stage, as a captain of the team. So mayors, they have the profile, they have the ability to set the direction, they hold the pen, if you like, on strategies and so on, but then to make progress, they absolutely have to work in partnership. They need to build consensus among other local leaders and work with external stakeholders as well. And I think, good mayors, that really takes a certain kind of leadership, and a lot of the mayors we've got in place have shown how to do that. That also absolutely requires, I think you mentioned it, Emma, was that in the waiting room before, but working across party lines. I mean, I think you hear many of the mayors talking about place before party as a kind of guiding principle for them. And that's going to be ever more the case as our two-party system, fragments before our eyes. And most of these mayors now in post have to work with local leaders of other parties, sometimes 2, 3, 4 other parties. So if they take an overly partisan approach, they're just likely to run into problems. I mean, then in terms of like the core nature of the role, you made the distinction between the public-facing and internal organisational-facing aspects, and I think that's absolutely clearly that's a really useful distinction, because I think a core part of the role of mayors has been to be that visible public champion for the people and the communities that they represent. And I think in many of the places where this model's been established, there's an underlying sense of neglect in terms of public and private investment, a sense of democratic disengagement, and a lot of the mayors have come in and that's been part of their challenge. And, maybe some have done better than others, but I think certainly the likes of Andy Burnham or Ben Houchen, they've really succeeded in showing people and communities local that there's someone on their side fighting their corner, and that's really important. But then there's, of course, the private, more management side, if you like, that you spoke about, Jorrit, and the fact that this is a specific point, I think, that does really require a certain kind of skill set here. Because the model is so new, you do have a lot of mayors coming in to brand new and to some extent non-existent organisations. I mean, Luke Campbell, one of the mayors elected just earlier this month, up in East Yorkshire, has been tweeting photos of, beautiful, shiny, open plan office he's worked into with, very few staff, no organisation chart, no sense of how the mayoral office is going to work and so on. So there's something about coming in as a leader to almost a startup in many of those cases. And even in the more established places, we're only talking at most 10 years. So there isn't, in the way we have obviously in central government and maybe in other countries, a really established model for what does a strategic authority look like. And that's probably a challenge for a mayor, but it's also an opportunity. So I think Richard Parker in the West Midlands is really interesting if you hear about how he's come in and really tried to bring about cultural and organisational change and reflecting his own personal style of leadership, which he sees as more collaborative and collegiate than Andy Street, who he replaced. And, there's that opportunity to reshape the organisation. So I think that's an interesting factor as well. And then another thing in private is that role of the negotiator that you mentioned. So negotiating with private investors is part of it, but also with central government. That's a really key skill for mayors in this country, which maybe partly speaks to, again, the immaturity of the model and the fact that they don't have the resources or the fiscal powers to raise the money to do the things they want. So to some extent, they still have to come to Westminster and Whitehall cap in hand and make the case to ministers, which, maybe we'll move beyond that at some point. But at the moment, that's definitely a key part of the role. So I won't say much more. The final thing I just wanted to say, I do think what's very interesting as well, maybe it is similar elsewhere, I don't know. But what's striking about the mayors we've had in this country is what a range of backgrounds they've come to the job with. Mm-hmm. And I think that's led to different mayors seeing their role in quite different ways. So you've got, Andy Burnham, who's been a cabinet minister, very used to playing national politics game. You can see that in the way he operates as a mayor, frankly, very willing to try and set the tone of the national conversation, challenge prime ministers of both parties, and so on. But then you've got others, I think, who've come to it in quite a different way. I mentioned Andy Street. He was a business leader, I think, came in and saw his role more as sort of CEO of West Midlands Combined Authority, setting out the strategy, wanting everything to then be implemented in quite a structured way. By contrast, as I mentioned, Richard Parker's come in as a sort of management consultant, quite a different style, definitely not as high profile as someone like Andy Burnham, but behind the scenes, I think doing really interesting things in building the consensus for the things he wants to achieve. And then you've got others like Luke Campbell and to some extent Ben Houchen, who really come in as outsiders and lean into that, and I'm the I'm the ordinary, guy on the street, gonna fight against the establishment, against Westminster for your interests. So I think again that sort of speaks to the still quite embryonic status of mayors in this UK, that we don't really know what an effective organisation looks like. We also don't know what is the right background and characteristics of a mayor, and it's enabling, I think, some quite different, interesting styles of leadership to be tested out. So I'll leave it there, and really interested to speak further.
Fantastic. Thanks, Akash. You're right. I wanted to pick up on some of the things that Akash has talked about. He's spoken about the fact that we're kind of in an institution building mode here at the moment. You have new mayors. It's a relatively new model. People, as he's described with Luke Campbell, are coming into, kind of empty offices. I know that the model is different in the US and is clearly kind of more established, but I also know that you often work on mayoral transitions where you have people coming into the role, at least for the first time. And I wonder whether you have any reflections based on your work on transitions about what mayors need to do to succeed in those early kind of days, weeks and months in role, whether that's personally or in the sense of kind of institution building.
Yeah. So thank you, Akash, for your reflections. I know a few of the people you mentioned, and really resonates your reflections on what it's like to step into those roles in a new institutional arrangement, so to speak. And Emma, as you mentioned, the moving into a new role, the role of a mayor, is daunting for anyone, regardless the context. There's nothing that quite prepares you for it, but hopefully our organization helps a little bit by, we provide mayors, at least in the US, with an opportunity after they've been elected and before they take office to pause and reflect, like, what am I going to do with this opportunity? And I'll give you 2 examples of what the things are that we've learned from working with mayors that are particularly important at that inflection point. One is to prepare for that public-facing role. The cameras are on you. Everything you do is now public. Because you're a politician living in your city, you're more exposed to immediate reactions, and those are sometimes hostile. Right? And increasingly, we see that women mayors are exposed much more to online and in-person violence and harassment. And so that is extremely worrisome. It also means that you have to prepare for it so that you can effectively exercise your leadership role in that difficult, sometimes polarized and hostile context. Not everybody will like what you do, and on very many occasions, nobody will like what you do. Like, people find you go too far in one direction, and the other side feels you're not going far enough. And as a mayor, you got to navigate that, right? And so, to prepare for exercising leadership in that context requires, I think, how will I manage myself? How will I protect myself in the office? And so that is one thing. And how will I engage with, let's say, social media? How will I, engage with in public events and so forth? The second is the organization-facing piece, which is all about, can I assume that the organizational structure that I inherit is the right one? In other words, the org chart, in the United States, but in many other countries as well, you have the right to kind of hire your people coming in. But that doesn't mean that you have to simply replace the position that you had before. Let me give you an example. Mayor Wu in Boston, she is a fantastic leader. We're very proud of her. She is also a progressive leader that wanted to do a new Green Deal for Boston. So it's a coastal city, climate resilience is important, but more generally, what can the city of Boston do to be more responsive to climate change? And so, will you then appoint somebody in the Department of Environment? Or will you appoint a czar that works across the departments, that has more formal authority, or a deputy mayor for the environment? And so we wrote a case about that dilemma, and the great opportunity you have before you kind of step into the role is to think what structure would best serve your strategy? What type of staffing would best support your key priorities? Now, back to the UK context. In a way, it's hard to step into a newly created role of combined authorities, right? And a newly created role of a mayor of a combined authority. On the other hand, it's kind of an opportunity, right? Like you don't have the institutional legacy of, well, we've always done things this way. So, but it does require you to think about strategic priorities before you think about structure. I think the mistake people in general often make, but also mayors, is that you obsess about the governance structure before you even know exactly what it is that you want to focus on and how you want to accomplish your goals. And so thinking in a problem-oriented or an opportunity-oriented way about the work is like, what does my area, my city, my region need? And what can we do to bring the right people together to deliver on that?
Thank you. And I'm going to come to the audience after one more question from me. Akash talked a bit about kind of political fragmentation in the UK. We are seeing the English mayoral model become politically diverse, or at least more diverse. Labour had a near monopoly on these mayors until relatively recently. Now we have 2 Conservatives, we have 2 new Reform mayors alongside the 10 Labour mayors. I'm wondering if collaboration is a big part of what mayors can do, bringing people together, kind of convening them, not just in their areas, but across kind of mayoral lines as well. What insights do you have about how mayors can work in a cross-partisan or bipartisan way as the mayoralties in England become more politically diverse?
Yes, it's interesting. In the United States, there is also political and ideological diversity. What we find there is, even though at the national level there is more political polarization, at the local level there isn't as much. And one explanation, and it's just a hypothesis, is that the closer you get to the realities on the ground, the less opportunity you have and the less patience you can have for rhetoric, for ideological divisions, for political bickering and so forth. Like, you actually need to get stuff done. And that's a kind of a reality check. And so we find that both Democratic and Republican mayors, there's more easy convergence. That's not to say that there's no conflict at the local level. People can disagree very ferociously about, a new zoning policy, about a new parking policy, about, a new capital project. Of course, it is a political debate, always. But I think there is a little bit more focus on how can we get work done, where can we find common ground, because ultimately everybody is being held accountable for results. And those results are more visible and tangible at the local level in the short term.
Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to come out to audience questions now. I've got lots coming in online, but I want to give people a chance in the room. Great, lots of hands up. Can you please let us know your name and which organisation you're from? We've got one here, one here, one here.
Hi, Rosie Fogden, Growth and Reform Network, formerly Centre for Progressive Policy. So we are a kind of network that works both with combined authorities and mayors and also with local authorities. So I was wondering, in all of the international examples that you've seen, what are the key features of places where you see mayors having a really good relationship with their kind of constituent areas and constituent councils? Because that's something that we're sort of thinking quite a lot about at the moment.
Thank you. We have one here.
Hello, thank you very much. So it's Peter Buffoni from Gateby Sanderson, so Headhunter. But I'm just curious, touch on the last points you were talking about. The capacity and capability of the mayors themselves, really interesting. I'm not sure whether from the research how much has been done about the selection of those candidates politically in the first instance, and whether actually that's at odds with localisation anyway. Your point about Andy Burnham is well made. Would they necessarily pick someone who's then going to be difficult for them later? So I'm just curious about whether any of your research has shown the selection of those candidates that are put to people then.
Thank you very much. And then one here.
Thanks. Adam Roberts, Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I'd like to see if you have a view on a number of the things Akash mentioned. Some of the mayors we have and are likely to have in coming years will be covering non-urban areas. So Cumbria, for example, has a population of 500,000, but spread across 2,500 square miles. Do you have any particular lessons for mayors who are covering regions, non-urban areas, rather than cities?
Brilliant, thanks very much. Okay, so kind of key features of mayors having good relationships with kind of councils and so on, candidate selection, and then lessons for mayors in non-urban areas. I'm going to come to you first, then Akash, on to you.
So I can tackle two of those three questions. Let me start with your question. We don't have research that we have done on the selection of candidates. We typically work with them when they have been elected, and so it's a very interesting question. I do agree with Akash that it is quite interesting to see what trajectory led to somebody becoming the mayor, and we have mayors in our program with very diverse backgrounds. Some people have the maximum number of people that they have managed is like 5, and then they start running a city with 200,000 employees, right? And we have people with backgrounds as city council person and people who are completely new to politics and come in as a former business person. And so we haven't seen any immediate relationship between the background and the success in office. My hypothesis, other things matter more than the background. And so, in a way, nobody is really prepared for the job. Some more prepared in some aspects than others. But it's a very interesting question. To the point about relationships with constituents. So we spent the first day of our program on that exact topic. There is a default expectation that every speech that you give has to be about communicating your vision and your priorities. What we invite mayors to do is to think a lot more about how do we build relationships with people in a way that's not one-directional, that's more inviting to constituents to become part of the problem-solving effort. So very concretely, that means that we spend a lot of work with mayors thinking about talking why they care, what motivated them to run for office. And then, of course, your answer could be, well, I want to change this problem, that problem. But to go even deeper and make it more personal, the distrust in government has a lot to do with the fact that people don't trust people's motivations to run for office. Like, why are you here? What do you want? Why do you care? I don't believe your speeches. And turns out when you work with mayors, if they go back earlier in their careers or early in their lives, there are moments that made them care. And we encourage and facilitate mayors to talk about those moments because those are more humanizing. And those, talking about why you care, what the values are that bring you to office, are important opportunities to connect with the values that people, your residents, your constituents hold. So my colleague Marshall Gans works for an entire day with mayors to explore story of self, which is who are you and why do you care? Story of us. What do we have in common beyond partisan lines? And we might be very different in our beliefs and our experience and concerns and interests, but there is something that we as a city share, and what is that? And then the third is the story of now. Like, what is it that requires action, not just from the mayor, not just from the city, but from the community as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's a whole different approach to public engagement, which is much more relational than policy-oriented. And final question about the rural areas. We did some research on intercity collaboration. We see that as a global phenomenon, increasingly, there are many more places and modes of collaborating from city to city globally, but also in regional areas. And obviously, you don't have the economy of scale, right? If there is an area with many different smaller, hubs, and so the idea of shared services and regional coordination becomes then a really important model. And there are different models that we've identified. There hasn't been a lot of research on this, but obviously in the UK, you're 8 years in on the combined authorities. It's going to be a great opportunity to study what has worked, what hasn't worked, which of those models that we see in practice are more conducive to the type of government effectiveness that you would want out of it, which models, because that's the flip side of it, just lead to a lot of talking and less effective and efficient collective action. That's what I'll say about that.
Thank you. Akash?
Yeah, thanks. Good, interesting questions. I mean, on the candidate selection point, it's not something we've particularly looked at, but it's obviously crucial that the process, leads to the right kind of people coming through. I mean, in terms of how it's worked so far, I think, I do get the impression that the Labour Party, behind the scenes has been quite active centrally, making sure the shortlist includes their favoured candidate. There's not been too many sort of big controversies. I mean, Jamie Driscoll up in the northeast, I remember, was outright blocked from standing, even though he was the previous mayor of the north of Tyne. But elsewhere, yes, I think they've kind of used back channels to get favoured people in post to some extent. Would they be happy to see another Burnham coming through? I don't know. I mean, he's done a good job in many ways. It's an interesting question. On the other questions, I mean, I think the one about relations between mayors and local leaders. I mean, I guess I touched upon that a bit already. I mean, I don't want to point fingers, but I do think it's an absolutely core skill and facet of being effective as a mayor in the combined authority model that, you recognise the constitutional limitations of the role that you hold and see other local leaders as partners, as allies, as members of your team, and work to build those relationships in order to make progress in a collaborative way. And I think some have come in a bit more prepared for that than others, and something they've had to learn because, the constitutional rules are what they are. If you want to get a budget through, if you want to get a spatial plan through, a transport strategy through, if the other local leaders are against you, it's not going to happen. So that's absolutely crucial. And then your question, Adam, I mean, that's a really interesting one as we see the model expand to rural areas, polycentric economic geographies, to use the jargon. It's something we're hoping to do some work on this year, which hopefully will be valuable to places. I mean, a couple of observations though. I mean, I do think some of the mayors are already grappling with this already. Claire Ward in the East Midlands is very interesting on it. In recent interviews I've heard with her about the need to develop a different kind of growth strategy, different kind of transport strategy than the ones applicable or appropriate for where the combined authority model started. So in somewhere like Greater Manchester or Liverpool City region, to some extent, West Midlands, South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, there's a sort of hub and spokes economic geography. The transport plan reflects that, spatial planning, skills, thinking about where you need to invest in skills and so on. It all flows from that economic geography. That's very different in somewhere like the East Midlands. And I think that the model has to, and the style of leadership has to reflect that. And I think there's other things that come with it as well in some of those places that it's a job for mayors in big regions that don't have a history of collaborating on that scale, not just to decide on where you're going to allocate resources and where the bus routes are going to run and all that important stuff. There's also a deeper thing about building a regional identity, or building the sense that this is a political level that people should feel affiliated to, and moving beyond, I think, where a lot of combined authorities start, which is, it's a collection of local authorities who maybe have all just signed up for the deal because they're going to get a little bit of funding for this project and that project and that project. And there's something for a mayor, particularly in those kind of places, in elevating the conversation to the regional level. I heard one of the mayors use that phrase recently. And building the sense of the region as a demos, if you like.
Akash, there are a couple of questions that have come in online about the kind of limitations, at least so far, of the powers that have been involved in England. Somebody observes that, the three examples that you're at outlined, tax collection in Kampala, fiscal instruments in Bilbao, and then kind of powers over housing in Buffalo, are all areas that at the moment, are not within the powers of combined authority mayors in the UK, and, are asking whether that's a problem in England and whether that's a problem. And I guess kind of relatedly, that as you've both discussed, one of the features of being a mayor is that really high kind of public recognition. People know who you are, have expectations about what you should be delivering. But actually, we don't have kind of proper fiscal devolution at the moment. So is that a fault line? Could that lead to failure of the model?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're definitely in favour of further devolution. We've made that argument many times, and I think the government's white paper is moving in the right direction, and we're waiting to see the devolution bill coming soon, I hope. Maybe someone from MHCLG can tell us, but if everything in the white paper gets implemented, I think that will be a genuine step forward. We'll see regional spatial planning, fuller devolution of key functions like transport, skills, housing, moves into other areas like health and a role in net zero and so on. But I think employment support as well. Clearly there's further to go in many of those areas, and certainly fiscal devolution has just been ruled out of court at the moment. That debate is not going to go away, I'm sure. The mayors have definitely been arguing for it in different ways, privately and publicly. That's going to, I think, it might be one for the next Parliament, who knows, but I don't think the model will feel complete until there is genuine revenue-raising power held at that level. And then, sorry, what was the other question?
I think you've answered them.
I've answered them both, yeah,
well
brilliant.
So it is a very important question, and jurisdictional powers, or the lack thereof, are real, of course. I would also say that that's always going to be the case. You're never going to have as much formal authority as you'd like to have, or as many resources as you'd like to have. And so the example of Bilbao is a good one, because the city of Bilbao did not have all the formal authority to do it, but they worked together with other levels of government who did have some parts of the solution, the national level, the regional level, the local level, and then of course some help needed to come from the private sector, investments and so forth, and across party lines. So it was multi-level governance and cross-sectoral collaboration all at once. No single party could have transformed Bilbao by itself. The national government couldn't have done it either without the local government. So I think with the most complex problems, you're always going to look at this fragmentation of jurisdictional authority, and you need to bring the expertise and the resources together. And what I would say is that mayors are in a unique position to lead that effort, because they can lead with the moral authority and the local knowledge of the community, and say, this is what we want to be, this is who we want to be, this is what we can be. And the challenge, of course, is when a problem is so big, when we're talking about economic growth, or crime reduction, or affordable housing, or restructuring transportation and so forth, you got to start somewhere. So let me give you an example from the UK. South Yorkshire, Mayor Oliver Coppert was extremely concerned about health inequities in that area. And there was a lot of research that the health disparities were along ethnic and racial lines, and you know, low-income people would significantly have less access to health care. And then, of course, as a mayor, like, what can you do about it, right? You need, like, the national government, you need many more resources and powers to do something about that. However, because they were close to the problem and close to the constituents, they identified what we call an entry point. And an entry point is a piece of the problem that you can start to work on that allows you to bring parties together and to show what's possible. And so the entry point that they chose was what they called bed poverty. 1 in 9 babies in South Yorkshire leaves the hospital without having the assurance that there is a crib at home. And they said, okay, that's concerning, right? So why don't we start a Beds for Babies program? And they brought the private sector, health institutions, community organizations all together and formed a team that launched this program, Beds for Babies. And it basically means that, you know, when a baby is born and the parents cannot afford a crib, that is provided. Now, does that solve the whole health disparities problem? No. But it allows you to have a point of contact with the family and see what else is needed. It allows you to learn more about the problem and identify other things that you could do that are in the adjacent possible. But it also builds the trust and the collaborative relationships that you need to kind of build on that. So that's what I see the most effective mayors do. They start somewhere and they drive change by getting started, and then they can show what's possible.
Thank you. Akash, you want to come back?
Yeah, no, just on that, I mean, it's a really interesting initiative, that one, and we're going to be watching this space, but we're shortly going to be launching a series of events and case studies, which we're going to be calling the Devo Lab, looking at and shining a light on specific policy innovations. And the South Yorkshire Bed for Babies scheme is one of the ones we'll be looking at. So, yeah, I'd be interested in comparing notes as to what you found about that specific one. But, yeah, that's going to be something coming up before the summer here at the IFG.
Thanks, Akash. OK, we've probably got time for, say, 1 or 2 more questions in the room. We've got one here and one there. Thanks.
Hi, Amy from the International Centre for Sustainability. You mentioned briefly about city-to-city collaborations and collaborations between mayors. Labour mentioned in the Brown Commission the potential for an Assembly of Nations and Regions. I'd just like to know both of your thoughts on the representation of municipal regions at national level and potentially what the future of representation for, say, Greater Manchester within a second chamber in the UK, and what that could look like for us. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Then I have one here.
Thanks. Aileen Murphy, Honorary Professor, University of Durham. When you mentioned, Akash, about we've only had, the mayors are really only 10 years old, and when the professor was talking about large and complex bureaucracies that have been there for a while, I did wonder if we're not missing something really obvious, given where we're sitting, is that the Mayor of London's been there for 20-odd years, and it is a completely different model, well, in some ways, what we've got now, and whether we're not just missing that as an opportunity for learning, really.
Brilliant. OK, so learning from Mayor of London and then kind of nations and regions, municipal regions. Akash?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, the London model, I think, does get maybe less attention paid to it than it deserves. But I think, you know, partly because that's clearly not the model that this government or the previous government is looking to replicate anywhere else. As the combined authority model is very different, of course, having a powerful executive mayor and an assembly holding him or her to account. So, yeah, I think there's definitely lessons to be learnt from the successive mayors of London in terms of how they've led the city, how they've used the powers, the policy innovations we've seen. And, yeah, I mean, we're hoping to do some work in that space. Whether other parts of the country could learn from the London devolution settlement, interesting question. I mean, we are, you know, quite interested in the accountability regime for regional mayors. So indeed is the government, which is good to see. There's definitely, thinking underway about moving beyond what's a kind of slightly weak model of scrutiny committees within combined authorities, maybe to something a bit more public, like a local or regional public accounts committee. Could you go beyond that to having a Assembly of Greater Manchester, an Assembly of West Yorkshire, and etc.? Yes, in principle, of course. It doesn't feel like it's close to being, on the agenda at the moment, but maybe that should be considered as a kind of longer term option. And then, on the other question, the Assembly of Nations and Regions idea that Gordon Brown proposed, that would draw upon practice in federal systems elsewhere, where representatives of subnational governments form the upper chamber. I wasn't surprised that Labour, when it comes to manifesto writing, ran a mile from those proposals. I don't particularly expect it to be back as far as the government's thinking is concerned. Should it be? Maybe. It's not a model I've looked at in great detail. I think we are very pro greater institutionalization of intergovernmental working or partnership working between subnational and national governments. So I think the Council of Nations and Regions that has been set up is an interesting initiative. It brings together the mayors with the leaders of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland for the first time. Not quite sure what it's there to achieve. It's only met once so far. I think there's another meeting coming up later this month. I think it's quite important that there is that kind of forum for interchange of ideas and not exactly joint decision making, but attempts to reach agreement on key things. We're not quite there yet, so I think important issue.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
You're right, and consider these your closing remarks.
Okay,
and waste of
great.
time.
So I often get asked about local government structures and governance structures in the United States, and then I have to say, well, there's so many of them. Even within Massachusetts, where I live, we have multiple models of local governance. And the question is one model better than the other? Most mayors that I work with say, I'd love my governance to be slightly different. And sometimes that means I'd like to have more responsibility. And sometimes it means I'd like to have less responsibility for this or the other issue for whatever reason. I've said something similar before, and I think it's really important that the most pressing problems facing cities will always require multiple organizations. And so no single organization or level of government can actually tackle them. So when you think about the jurisdictional constraints or the ideal governance structure of your municipal government, that might be less relevant than the model of problem solving that you adopt. And by that I mean, what is the process of diagnosing your problems, teaming up with the right other entities, challenging your current theories of change, what are you currently doing, generating promising practices from elsewhere, and building the capabilities to adapt those to your local context, or coming up with entirely new ideas. And so the model of problem solving might actually be more helpful to kind of seriously consider than the governance model. Also because it takes typically a long time to change governance structures. There's multiple rounds, and you can completely get bogged down by that. Whereas a focus on the process of problem solving can actually allow you to start somewhere and then take it from there. The other thing I will say about the relationship with the national government, I'm reminded of what Lyndon B. Johnson, the American president, said about mayors. He said, well, sometimes when the responsibilities of the presidency seem particularly heavy, I think to myself, it could be worse. I could be a mayor. And what I like about that is there's an appreciation for how hard that job is, but there is also an appreciation implicitly for how important and meaningful it can be. And with the 300 plus mayors that we've worked with, everybody will agree this is a pretty brutal job. But the far majority of the mayors that we work with, so it's also the most rewarding job I've ever had in my life or will ever have in my life, because you can make a difference and you can see that difference. And I think for that reason, national governments should not only appreciate, but also facilitate that work. And sometimes that means facilitating the learning from city to city. Sometimes it means really providing the analytic capacity and resources to learn locally and evaluate what's working, what isn't. But also really think of it in a non-binary way. When you think about devolution, you could think about it as well, now it's your problem. We make a deal, here's some money, you take on these responsibilities and you figure it out. I don't think that's a productive relationship. I'm not saying that that's the case here, but in some countries that has been the case. Devolution or decentralization has meant just pushing stuff to, and sometimes that meant unfunded mandates, right? But you're still one country, and you need to change the relationship between federal or national government and local government in a learning orientation. Now that you have those responsibilities, what is it that we can do to help you succeed? What is it that we have to learn from what you're doing at the local level that may require changes in legislation at the national level? And conversely, what can local authorities and cities do to help co-produce the results that national governments set and the priorities that they set? So it has to be a mutually beneficial and respectful relationship, and learning is the key point in all of that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jorrit, and what a good moment to close on. We are just over time, so I'm going to have to finish here. Sorry, I know there were lots of more questions online and in the room. Huge thanks to both our panellists, and particularly to Jorrit, who's joined us all the way from the States. We've been delighted to host you here, and there's clearly so much we can learn from the work that you've been doing in Harvard. Big thanks to the audience in person and online for all your brilliant questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.